June 19, 1944. The Philippine Sea shimmered like molten glass under the morning sun, broken only by the wakes of steel giants. American aircraft carriers fanning across the blue like floating fortresses. On the Japanese carrier Taiho, Lieutenant Saburo Kato squinted against the glare. His gloved hands rested lightly on the controls of his A6M0, the same aircraft that had once ruled the Pacific. Around him, mechanics shouted final checks. The air smelled of gasoline, salt, and adrenaline. A deck officer's signal flag snapped, and the engines began their metallic chorus. Hundreds of cylinders howling in unison as Japan's proud air arm prepared to strike. To Kato, the new American fighter he'd heard about, the Hellcat, was a joke. They called it the flying drum. A lumbering, heavy beast too slow, too fat, too crude to match the elegant grace of a Zero. He smirked at the thought. American machines were built like their pilots, big, clumsy, overconfident. The Zero, by contrast, was a blade in the sky. But even as he thought it, the horizon trembled with heat, and far beyond it waited something different. Something born from American steel and stubbornness. A machine that would soon make the word invincible sound like mockery. The morning calm was deceptive. The ocean was vast, but every wave hid death beneath it. Radios hissed across both fleets as scouts relayed fragments of coordinates. The Japanese believed they were hunting a wounded American force. Fresh carriers and green pilots still learning the ropes. Confidence rippled through the decks. Officers laughed. "We'll wipe them out by noon," one said, lighting a cigarette. "They're new fighters? They're just heavy toys." The pilots chuckled. Many of them had fought since Pearl Harbor. They'd survived the Coral Sea, Guadalcanal, Rabaul. They believed themselves immortal. Across the sea, aboard the USS Lexington, Ensign David McCampbell ran a cloth over the nose of his F6F Hellcat. He was 24, tall, soft-spoken, with eyes that rarely blinked when he stared into the wind. The Hellcat loomed behind him, broad-winged, thick-skinned, painted navy blue with the white star and bar insignia. To the untrained eye, it looked bulky, even ugly. But up close, it radiated menace. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine throbbed with restrained fury, 2,000 horsepower caged under the cowling. McCampbell ran his hand along a patch of chipped paint near the fuselage and smiled. "Let them laugh," he muttered. "We'll see who's laughing tonight." At 0900 hours, a Japanese scout plane sighted Task Force 58, the largest American carrier group ever assembled. The message, transmitted in code, electrified the Japanese fleet. Enemy located east of the Marianas. Commence attack. One by one, Zeros and dive bombers lined up for launch, wheels trembling against the deck as propellers screamed into full throttle. The first wave leapt into the air, 70, 80, 90 planes at a time, climbing into a blazing sky streaked with sunlight and vapor. From afar, the spectacle was beautiful, a rising storm of wings. But hidden behind that beauty was overconfidence, the kind that history punishes without mercy. The Americans detected them first. Radar, an advantage the Japanese still underestimated, painted a glowing arc on the screens of the Enterprise in Yorktown. Incoming bogies, bearing 320, range 150 miles. An operator shouted. On the flag bridge, Admiral Mark Mitcher leaned over the chart. His voice was calm. "Launch the CAP," he said. Combat Air Patrol, Hellcats already circling the fleet, peeled off into formation, climbing toward the dots. Within minutes, dozens more Hellcats screamed from carrier decks, their folded wings snapping open like blades. The ocean below shrank as they climbed through bright haze into the upper air where fate waited. To Kato's squadron, the first contact came like a mirage. Far ahead, dark specks shimmered in the light, closing fast. Enemy fighters. 12 o'clock. The radio crackled. Kato tightened his harness. "Maintain formation. Remember, one pass and they're gone." His heart drummed. The sky filled with motion, with streaks of light and the pulsing whine of engines. He saw them now. Hellcats, diving out of the sun, sunlight flashing off their wings like silver knives. He'd expected slow, clumsy opponents. What he saw instead were predators. The first Hellcat came head-on, guns flickering. Tracers ripped through air and metal. A Zero exploded into orange fire, fragments tumbling toward the sea. Kato jerked his stick, rolled left, then climbed. The Hellcat followed, relentless. Its engine roar was deeper, hungrier. He banked again, trying to loop behind it, but the American climbed faster. Impossible, he thought. No plane that heavy should climb like that. He pulled into a dive, the GS crushing his chest. Bullets tore past his canopy. For the first time in his career, Kato felt hunted. Meanwhile, McCampbell fired short bursts, leading targets, his thumb steady on the trigger. Each burst felt like thunder through his arms. He saw one Zero spiral away, another disintegrate under his guns. His radio was alive with chatter. Pilots calling kills, warnings, laughter mixed with disbelief. "They're dropping like flies," someone yelled. Another voice, quieter, "It's a massacre up here." McCampbell didn't reply. He was focused, eyes scanning, breath measured. The Hellcat moved like an extension of his body, heavy on paper, but graceful in his hands. By mid-morning, the sky was a chaos of contrails and smoke. Parachutes dotted the horizon like white flowers over a burning garden. The Japanese formation collapsed into fragments, each pilot fighting alone. Kato found himself low on ammo, fuel needle dropping. He'd managed to down one Hellcat, maybe, but his squadron was gone. Every turn brought another burst of gunfire, another flash of death. He saw an American plane fly past, the pilot's face visible through the glass. Young, calm, unshaken. That look unnerved him more than bullets. It was the look of someone who knew the outcome already. On the carrier decks below, sailors shaded their eyes, watching the distant dogfights. Every few seconds, a burning plane plunged into the water, sending plumes of steam and debris into the air. Loudspeakers blared updates. Enemy aircraft approaching. Intercepted at 50 miles. Cheers erupted when the reports came back. Multiple kills confirmed. The Hellcat, once mocked as too slow, too ugly, was carving its legend in the sky. By noon, the Japanese radio channels were a nightmare of static and panic. Messages overlapped, calls for help, confused coordinates, screams cut short. The command centers on the carriers tried to make sense of it, but the truth was simple and horrifying. Their pilots were dying faster than they could count. The Hellcat swarmed in disciplined groups, diving, shooting, climbing, each movement precise. It wasn't chaos for them. It was orchestration, the cold music of mastery. Kato's fuel warning light blinked red. He turned south, hoping to find a carrier to land on, but the horizon was smoke and fire. He glanced down and saw the ocean glittering with oil and wreckage. His comrades, his fleet, everything he believed in, scattered like ashes. His radio crackled once more, a faint voice. "Retreat! Retreat!" Then silence. He knew it was over. As the sun climbed higher, McCampbell led his flight back toward the fleet, wings shimmering with salt and victory. Below him, the sea reflected the scars of battle. Burning patches of oil, drifting lifeboats, black smoke trailing into the sky. He didn't cheer. He just whispered to himself, "They never saw it coming." By sunset, over 350 Japanese aircraft lay at the bottom of the sea. The Americans had lost fewer than 30. The men aboard the carriers looked out across the fading light and knew something had changed forever. The age of Japanese air supremacy had ended, not with a slow decline, but with a single day of thunder. They called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But for those who flew it, it wasn't funny. It was history tipping its balance. They thought the rookies couldn't fly. They never saw the trap waiting in the clouds. By nightfall, Japan's air might was gone. Before the Hellcat became a legend, it was a problem child. A lump of steel and ambition that almost died before it could fly. In 1942, America was desperate. The Japanese Zero ruled the skies, its agility unmatched, its pilots seasoned killers. The U.S. Navy needed a fighter that could not just compete but dominate. A machine that could take hits, outclimb, outgun, and outlast the enemy. The first answer, the F4F Wildcat, was brave but outdated. It lacked speed and climb, Its pilots fought valiantly at Midway and Guadalcanal, but the price was blood. When they came home, the engineers at Grumman listened. They needed something stronger, something meaner. In a dimly lit hangar on Long Island, 1942, draftsmen bent over blueprints like soldiers over maps. Leroy Grumman, founder of the company, paced the floor with his tie loosened and sleeves rolled up. "Build it like a truck," he told them. "The pilots can't afford fragile." His engineers stared at the design sketches, the F6F Hellcat, a beast powered by the new Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine. It was massive, almost absurdly so. Even on paper, it looked wrong. The wings were too thick, the fuselage too high, the cockpit visibility poor. Test pilots doubted it. "It'll be a flying coffin," one said. But Grumman smiled. "Let's see what happens when we light it up." The first prototype took to the air on June 26, 1942. It roared down the runway, engines bellowing like a storm. For a moment it lifted, then sagged, sluggish, awkward. Engineers winced. On landing, one of the test pilots climbed out, his helmet slick with sweat. "She's heavy," he said. "Fast in a straight line, but she turns like a brick." The words cut deep. They wanted grace, but they built brute force. For weeks, the team tinkered, adjusting the wings, refining the propeller pitch, reinforcing the landing gear. They stripped weight where they could, added armor where they must. The Navy demanded results. Pilots in the Pacific were dying every week. The Japanese Zero still owned the air, and the news reached them daily. Another carrier hit, another squadron lost. The Hellcat had to work. It had to be the miracle machine. In the wind tunnel, they tested airflow with smoke lines. The room filled with the hiss of fans, the smell of hot oil, and the hum of electric motors. Grumman himself stood beside the model, hands behind his back, watching the way air slid along its curved wings. "Make it simple," he kept saying. "Simple saves lives." They built the control systems with thick cables that could take a bullet and still move. They made the landing gear strong enough to slam down on carrier decks again and again without breaking. The cockpit armor was like a steel bathtub around the pilot. Ugly, maybe, but indestructible. Then came the engine, the soul of the Hellcat. The R2800 double wasp was no ordinary motor. It was a twin-row radial monster, 18 cylinders, 2,000 horsepower. When it roared to life, it shook the floor. Engineers covered their ears as flames spat from the exhaust stacks. The vibration rattled windows half a block away. But in that sound was the future, a promise that American pilots would never again fly underpowered. The second prototype flew in July. This time it climbed faster, turned tighter, and landed smoother. The pilots grinned. "Now we're talking," one said. The plane could reach 380 miles per hour, climb to 20,000 feet in minutes, and carry 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns. It wasn't pretty, but it didn't need to be. It was a weapon, not a dancer. Still, there were doubts. The first combat reports from the Pacific warned that the Zero could still outturn almost anything. The Navy worried that the Hellcat's heavier weight would make it vulnerable in dogfights. Grumman countered with data. The Hellcat could dive faster, absorb hits that would shred a Zero, and climb back home with holes in its wings. "We're not building acrobats," he said. "We're building survivors." Then came the field trials. The first Hellcats arrived at NAS Norfolk for Navy pilot evaluation. Among them was Lieutenant Commander Edward "Butch" O'Hare, America's first naval ace and Medal of Honor recipient. He was respected, calm, methodical. When he stepped into the cockpit, the mechanics fell silent. He taxied out, throttled up, and took off into a perfect blue sky. For 15 minutes, they waited. Then he came in low, rolled over the runway in a barrel roll, and landed with a grin. "She's a killer," he said simply. "Just teach the boys to trust her." Those words carried all the way to the Pacific Fleet. By late 1943, the first squadrons equipped with Hellcats were shipped aboard carriers Essex, Yorktown, Enterprise. Pilots looked at the thick-winged plane and doubted it again. "Looks like a barrel with wings," someone joked. Another muttered, "Too much armor, not enough soul." But when they took off for their first missions against the Japanese, everything changed. Over the Marshall Islands, November 1943, the Hellcat faced the Zero for the first time. Lieutenant Hamilton McWhorter, barely 21, dived on a formation of 3 Japanese fighters. The Zero pilots broke formation to chase him. He rolled, pulled, and climbed, his engine roaring like a hurricane. The Zero behind him fired, bullets pinging against his armor. He turned sharply and fired back. One burst, one explosion of tracers, and the Zero vanished in flame. McWhorter returned to the carrier shaking, but alive. The after-action report stunned the brass. 13 Hellcats against 52 Zeros, 13 kills, no losses. The myth of Japanese invincibility began to crack. Word spread quickly. The Hellcat was easy to fly, stable to land, and forgiving under stress. Pilots who had once feared dogfights now sought them. They called it the Ace Maker. Every new pilot felt like a veteran after just a few sorties. It could take damage that would tear other planes apart. Holes through the wings, missing panels, engines coughing smoke, and still bring its pilot home. Mechanics joked that it was a flying tank that could punch back. In the Pacific, the change was immediate. Air superiority shifted like a tide turning. On carrier decks, crews painted victory marks, small red suns, on Hellcat noses. By spring 1944, the numbers were staggering. 2,000 Japanese aircraft destroyed, 270 Hellcats lost. The ratio seemed unreal, but the pilots knew it wasn't luck. It was design, training, and steel. And yet, in the halls of Tokyo, disbelief reigned. Japanese analysts studied fragments of downed Hellcats and shook their heads. Too heavy, they wrote. Too crude. They could not understand how something so inelegant could win. Pride blinded them. They doubled down on lighter, faster designs, never realizing that the war had changed. Back at Grumman's plant, production roared. Men and women worked day and night, riveting aluminum, fitting engines, painting navy blue coats under harsh lights. The sound never stopped. A symphony of hammers, drills, and engines on test stands. Every 57 minutes, another Hellcat rolled out of the factory, ready for war. The workers called it Hell's Heartbeat. They knew what these machines would do. They'd seen the telegrams from pilots thanking them for lives saved. But no one, not the pilots, not the engineers, not even the admirals, could imagine what was coming. In June 1944, the Hellcat would face its greatest test. A battle so vast that the sky itself would turn into a graveyard. It would not just win, it would annihilate. It would erase nearly an entire air force in a single day. And when it was over, the same men who once called it the Flying Drum would whisper a different name. The Angel of Death. The Hellcat had gone from a doubted machine to a legend forged in smoke and sunlight. The question that remained, hanging in the Pacific wind, was simple. How far could one machine change the fate of a war? Dawn broke over the Philippine Sea on June 19, 1944, with a deceptive calm that felt almost sacred. The horizon was a golden line of light, the sea flat and endless. Beneath that calm waited 2 titans, the Imperial Japanese Navy and the U.S. Pacific Fleet, each preparing to write a new chapter in the war. The air was thick with the smell of oil, sweat, and salt. On American carriers, sailors moved with silent urgency, wheeling aircraft into position, tightening bolts, checking guns. The Grumman F6F Hellcats stood in rows like patient beasts, wings folded, blue paint glinting under the early sun. Mechanics patted their fuselages as if calming horses before a charge. On the flight deck of the carrier Lexington, Lieutenant David McCampbell stood beside his Hellcat, helmet under one arm, scanning the horizon. His crew chief handed him a clipboard. "Weather's good, sir. Fuel topped, guns loaded." McCampbell nodded, his eyes steady. "Let's see if the stories are true," he said. The stories that the Japanese were coming in force, that this would be the largest air battle the world had ever seen. At 8:30, Japanese scouts found the American fleet. Their report flashed across carrier radios. Enemy task force sighted, bearing 090 degrees. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding Japan's mobile fleet, gave the order. Launch all planes. The decks erupted into organized chaos. Engines coughed, then roared. One after another, Zeros, Judas, and Vals shot into the air, over 400 aircraft in 4 waves. They were Japan's last great strike force, flown by a mix of veterans and barely trained replacements. Their mission: destroy the American carriers and turn the tide of the war. The Japanese officers still believed their pilots were superior. They didn't know radar would betray them. Aboard the U.S. carriers, radar operators watched glowing arcs sweep the screens. The blips multiplied like a swarm. Large bogey formation inbound, bearing 320, range 150 miles. One shouted. Admiral Mark Mitcher, calm and unreadable, gave the order, "Launch all Hellcats." Sirens wailed. On every deck, engines screamed to life. Hellcats thundered down the decks, tail hooks snapping free, blue wings unfolding like a storm rising from the sea. Within minutes, the sky filled with hundreds of them, shining, climbing, relentless. They fanned out into the sun, guided by ground control from the carriers below. Each squadron had one command: intercept before they reached the fleet. McCampbell led his group, VF-15, into formation at 20,000 feet. The air was thin, cold. The radio crackled. Contact! 10 o'clock high, Angels 18. Black dots appeared in the distance, growing larger every second. The Japanese formation came on fast, sunlight glinting off spinning propellers. The first Hellcats dove. The battle began with a roar that shook the heavens. Dozens of contrails wove through the sky as fighters tangled at incredible speed. Hellcats streaked through the Japanese formations like blue thunderbolts, their 6.50 caliber guns blazing. Tracers ripped through the morning air, red and white lines intersecting in deadly geometry. Explosions bloomed across the sky. Orange flashes, smoke trails, spiraling debris. For the Japanese pilots, it was chaos. Their radios filled with panic. Too many. They're above us. They're everywhere. As disciplined American squadrons tore into their ranks, the Hellcat's armor shrugged off hits that would have shredded a Zero. Its power let it dive away, then climb back faster than the enemy could react. McCampbell rolled into a dive, his guns flashing. A Zero exploded ahead of him, turning into a fireball. He banked hard, spotting another Japanese fighter cutting across his wing. He pulled up sharply, nose to the sun, and fired again. The enemy plane disintegrated. "Splash 2, he called calmly. Around him, the radio chatter mixed awe and disbelief. "They're dropping like flies," one pilot shouted. Another, laughing, "It's like a turkey shoot up here." That phrase would stick, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. From below, sailors on the carriers watched the spectacle in awe. Against the endless blue, black dots twisted and burned, smoke drifting down like dark ribbons. Each glowing streak marked another kill. Hellcats streaked overhead in endless waves, chasing, firing, diving. The sky itself seemed alive with vengeance, courage, and the echo of history turning. By mid-morning, the first Japanese wave was gone. Out of 68 planes, barely a dozen limped away. The second wave met the same fate. Hellcats swarmed them before they could dive on the carriers. Enemy bombers intercepted at 70 miles, destroyed. Came the calm voice over the radio. Cheers erupted on the decks, but the airmen didn't celebrate yet. There were still hundreds more incoming. The third wave came just before noon. The Japanese, desperate, split their formations, hoping to break through the American defense screen. It didn't work. Radar and radio coordination kept the U.S. fighters always one step ahead. Hellcats pounced on them in groups of 4 and 6, rolling through clouds and sunbursts. Ensign Robert Burney described it later. You'd see a Zero fire, and before the pieces hit the water, there was another behind him. It never stopped. The Hellcats' ammunition belts glowed red-hot from constant firing. Pilots' arms ached from pulling GS. But they didn't stop. Each kill meant fewer bombs reaching the fleet below. At one point, McCampbell's fuel ran low, but he refused to turn back. He and his wingmen shot down 7 planes in a single sortie before landing, tanks dry, guns empty. "We were just cleaning house," he said afterward, exhaustion in his voice. By late afternoon, the fourth and final Japanese wave arrived, smaller, disorganized, terrified. Many of their pilots were rookies with barely 30 flight hours. They faced Hellcat aces with hundreds of hours in combat. It was no contest. The Americans shredded them in minutes. Some Japanese pilots, realizing they couldn't win, dove their planes straight into the sea rather than be gunned down. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the ocean. Smoke drifted for miles, blotting out the horizon. The sea below was littered with wreckage, burning oil slicks, twisted metal, empty life rafts. The smell of fuel and salt mixed with the stench of death. The radio finally went quiet. When the reports came in, the numbers stunned even the victors. That day, Hellcat pilots and carrier gunners destroyed nearly 500 Japanese aircraft. In return, the Americans lost fewer than 30 planes. Some pilots landed with bullet holes stitched across their wings, others with engines coughing smoke. But they landed. The Japanese carrier force had been gutted, its air groups annihilated. In Tokyo, the silence was devastating. Messages from the fleet stopped coming. One admiral wrote in his log, "We have lost the air." To the men aboard the American carriers, the realization came slowly. They just witnessed the death of Japan's naval aviation. Years of fear, of being hunted from the sky, ended in one blazing day. The Hellcat had done what no one thought possible. It turned rookies into aces, it made the impossible routine. As night fell, the carriers turned on their deck lights. Normally, that was forbidden during wartime, it made them visible targets. But Admiral Mitcher gave the order anyway. "Turn on the lights," he said. "Let our boys come home." Across the Black Sea, the decks of dozens of carriers glowed like floating cities, a beacon to weary pilots returning from the fight. Hellcats circled, engines sputtering, fuel near empty. They landed one by one, wheels slamming onto the decks, wings folding with metallic sighs. Sailors waved them in with paddles, shouting and laughing. Some pilots climbed out trembling, others too tired to speak. McCampbell stood at the edge of the deck, helmet in hand, watching the last of the planes land. The ocean stretched into darkness, lit only by burning oil and distant lightning. He thought of the enemy pilots, men like him, now gone. 500 in one day, someone said beside him. McCampbell didn't answer. He just whispered, "God help us all." The roar had faded, but its echo would last forever. In a single day, the Hellcat had changed the war. It had taken everything America had learned from failure, from loss, from mockery, and turned it into power. The sky belonged to them now. Above the smoke and ruin, the stars began to appear, silent witnesses to a day when arrogance met steel, and steel did not bend. The morning after the battle, the Philippine Sea was still burning. Oil fires drifted across the water, thick black smoke twisting into the pale dawn. Wreckage floated everywhere. Flak-shredded wings, splintered fuselages, bits of life vests, and shoes with no owners. The ocean that had been the pride of Japan's carriers was now their graveyard. Seabirds circled overhead, crying into the silence. Sailors aboard the American carriers stood at the rails and stared out across the destruction. None of them spoke. There was no cheering, no music, no victory parade. They had seen what domination looked like, and it wasn't glorious. It was quiet, final, and heavy. In the ready room of the USS Lexington, David McCampbell sat in his flight suit, helmet in his lap, still streaked with soot and sweat. The room was filled with men, some laughing nervously, some staring into nothing. A young pilot counted bullet holes in his jacket, 5 all in a line across his shoulder. "Lucky," someone said. McCampbell just nodded. He wasn't thinking about luck. He was thinking about the radio silence that had followed the last enemy transmission. He remembered the faces of the Japanese pilots he'd seen up close. Boys, really, turning toward him just before their planes vanished in fire. "We shot down 500, he whispered, as if saying it aloud might make it less impossible. On the carrier's command deck, Admiral Mark Mitcher reviewed the after-action reports. The numbers came in one column at a time. Enemy aircraft destroyed, American aircraft lost, pilots recovered, fuel expended. He paused at the totals. 476 confirmed kills, possibly more. 29 Americans missing. The arithmetic of history. He exhaled slowly, setting the clipboard down. When we met them, they died, he said quietly to his chief of staff, not in triumph but in disbelief. That line would later echo across the Pacific, a grim epitaph for Japan's air power. Far to the west, aboard what remained of the Japanese mobile fleet, the mood was devastation. Admiral Ozawa walked the decks of his carrier Zuikaku, his face gray with exhaustion. The flight crews were gone, the hangars empty, the air group destroyed. He had ships, but no eyes, no shield, no strike force. Japan's carriers were now just floating targets. Messages from Tokyo offered no comfort. The Empire's best pilots had died, and their replacements were boys barely out of flight school. Some officers still spoke of rebuilding, of new planes and tactics. Ozawa knew better. Without pilots, without experience, there was nothing left to rebuild. In Tokyo, the news was buried behind official propaganda. Newspapers called the battle a temporary setback. But inside the war ministry, generals sat in stunned silence. 500 in one day? One whispered. Impossible. But the reports were undeniable. The myth of Japanese aerial supremacy, the same myth that had begun with Pearl Harbor, was dead. The Hellcat had killed it. Back in America, newspapers told the story in headlines that blazed across front pages. U.S. Navy destroys Japanese Air Force in one day. At Grumman's factory in Long Island, workers stopped their machines and gathered around loudspeakers to hear the broadcast. When the numbers were read, hundreds of enemy planes destroyed, cheers erupted. A woman who had spent 2 years riveting wings wiped her hands on her apron and whispered, "My brother flies one of those." She looked at her coworkers and smiled through tears. For them, this wasn't just victory. It was proof that the sweat, noise, and sleepless nights in the factory had meant something. The Hellcat, once mocked as a clumsy brute, had become a legend. Pilots called it the ace maker, and the numbers proved why. By war's end, it would achieve a kill ratio of 19-1, the highest of any fighter in history. It would account for 3/4 of all aerial victories by the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps. Yet its pilots always spoke of it with a strange humility. They didn't call it graceful or beautiful. They called it reliable, forgiving, indestructible. It saved more lives than it took, one veteran said. It brought us home. But victory came with a shadow. The men who flew those missions carried the images of burning cockpits, of parachutes that never opened. They remembered the smell of aviation fuel and the sight of enemy pilots trying to bail out too late. For every triumphant photograph of smiling aces, there were nights when they woke drenched in sweat, hearing the sound of engines and gunfire in their dreams. We didn't hate them, McCampbell would later say of his Japanese opponents. They were brave. They just ran out of time. In the years after the war, historians would call the Battle of the Philippine Sea the moment when Japan's fate was sealed. Without air cover, its navy became helpless. Without carriers, it lost the ability to project power. Within months, the empire that had once dominated the Pacific was retreating island by island. The Hellcat didn't just win battles. It broke the enemy's spirit. Every engagement after June 1944 felt like a replay of that day. Japanese pilots flying into slaughter, outmatched in speed, armor, and training.